Welcome back to another episode of Armpit Intellectuals. I'm Zara.
And I'm Bilal. Today we'll be discussing the pivotal role of student union in Pakistan's political history and their potential impact on the country's so-called democratic landscape.
So-called indeed. It's been 40 years since General Ziaul Haq's regime banned student unions. This ban wasn't arbitrary. It was a calculated move by the ruling elite aimed at quelling democratic dissent and maintaining control. As noted by Amar Ali Jan in his Dawn article, Student Unions and the Struggle for Democracy, Pakistan's ruling class has long sought external support, especially from the US, to preserve its grip on power. This dynamic began in the 1950s when Pakistan aligned with the US through military pacts like SEATO and CENTO, embedding itself in the anti-communist camp during the Cold War.
The consequence of this alignment wasn't just global. It also led to internal distortions, including the militarization of the state and the centralization of political power. It's a lot of secession. These shifts resulted in a rigid, authoritarian political culture where dissent, particularly from the youth, was viewed as a threat to national security. Student movements, consequently, became some of the most vocal and organized forms of opposition to the state's authoritarian policies.
And the roots of student activism in Pakistan stretch back to the very inception of the country. The Muslim Students Federation, also known as MSF, which was closely tied to the All India Muslim League, played a critical role in mobilizing youth during the movement for Pakistan. In fact, Muhammad Ali Jinnah himself acknowledged the immense contributions of students. In a speech to students at Islamia College, Peshawar, Jinnah remarked on how students had been instrumental in the referendum that secured the region's decision to join Pakistan.
From the very beginning, students were more than just passive observers, the origins of political change. As Pakistan evolved, the landscape of student activism became more ideologically diverse. The largest student union in the mid-20th century was the leftist National Student Federation, which emerged as a key player. Its primary rival was the right-wing Islami Jamaat Talba, which has since become the largest student organization in the country. Pakistan ka matlab kya?
Goli kore mashallah. The involvement of religious student groups, particularly those aligned with madrasas, added another layer of complexity to student politics. As Heather A.H. Malik explains in his paper, Towards the Civic Culture, Student Activism and Political Dissent in Pakistan, religious student activists were divided in their approach. While some advocated for change through parliamentary democracy, others, frustrated by political failures, saw militancy as the only viable path, pushing for Taliban-style Sharia law.
But student activism in Pakistan isn't just about ideological divides. It's also about challenging the state's repression and fighting for fundamental rights. One of the most notable recent examples is the Student Solidarity March, which took place in November 2018 across 10 cities in Pakistan. This was followed by another wave of marches in 2019, showing the resilience of student activism for their rights against paramilitary violence and sexual harassment despite the continued ban on unions.
And Lal Khan. Have you heard of Lal Khan?
No, I haven't. I haven't fucking heard about Lal Khan.
Okay, fair enough. And for those who are listening who also have not heard of Lal Khan, Khan was a prominent Marxist theorist and founder of the leftist organization The Struggle. And he wrote about the dire conditions facing students today. He highlighted how both public and private educational institutions impose draconian measures on its students, including frequent expulsions, fines, and a quote-unquote suffocating environment. The curriculum itself, he argued, reflects a conservative, anti-critical thinking stance aimed more at instilling selfishness, competition, and careerism than fostering intellectual growth.
It's also worth noting that this repression didn't emerge out of nowhere. Zia's regime in the 1980s introduced a culture of violence, a sectarianism into student politics, which had lingered in many ways. The so-called Kalashnikov culture, referring to the proliferation of weapons and militant behavior among student groups, was one of Zia's legacies.
Quote unquote legacies, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
And well, in 2019, the Sindh government passed the Sindh Student Union Bill, which technically lifted the ban on student unions. But despite this legal development, I think we have yet to see the reemergence of truly active and influential student unions. And it's the state's grip on student activism which remains strong,
Mm-hmm.
especially in regions like Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where enforced disappearances of students, activists, journalists, and other intellectuals are frighteningly common.
Mm-hmm. The crackdown on student activism in these provinces is emblematic of a broader trend: the state's deep-rooted fear of intellectual dissent. Historically, this fear has manifested as violent repression, as you saw in the 71 Bangladesh Liberation War, though the groups was most aggressively targeted by Pakistan Army were Bengali intellectuals and students.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think historically, it's like, the pen is mightier than the sword.
Yeah.
So let's go after the intellects, because they're more terrifying to dictators and
Right.
fascists. I mean, Nazi Germany, they used to burn books.
Mm-hmm.
So book burning was
Book
common.
burning was common.
Yeah, it was just something that was practiced. And I think it's also important to remember that this repression of leftist movements didn't start with Zia. Of course, it was exacerbated
Right.
during his regime, but shortly after partition, leftist movements, particularly those associated with the Communist Party of Pakistan, CPP, were viewed with suspicion by the state. And the DSF, the Democratic Students Federation, which was the Communist Party student wing, was especially prominent in the early 1950s, and it played a key role in supporting the Bengali Students Federation, BSF. A lot of SFs. Protests against the imposition of Urdu as an
International language. Yeah, that started, I guess, as early as 1950s. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the first time when Qaeda-Azam, I think in 47, went to East Pakistan. He said, Urdu will be your national language.
Right.
I think that would have just started right there and then, I guess, Bengali Student Federation. Yeah.
Right.
So by 1954, though, the state had banned both the CPP and the DSF, viewing them as threats to national security. So yeah, by this time, you have the army in hold of the country.
Right. This was Ayub's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The fear was that these groups, with their communist leanings, were either aligned with the Soviet Union or with India, both of which were seen as hostile to Pakistan's national interest and the state's relationship with the US. It's interesting to see that DSF, they're just like students, and all of them would be India. I don't know. They have their own interest at stake, anyways.
Yeah, I think it was just like state suspicion around communism. I mean, that was also very influenced by the US, right?
US, exactly, yeah.
Because it was also around this time that I guess the Mujahideen started being trained by the CIA and ISI. So of course, we're very well aware of how much the Pakistani state loves its daddy, the United States.
United States of America.
Yeah. America. So I think, and of course the US has been this capitalist machine for a very long time, industrialization, but even before that, the theory that colonialism is basically a form of capitalism. Like colonialism basically transformed into capitalism.
Okay.
Because it's like colonialism was like a startup,
Okay.
not to minimize what happened, of course, but just this idea that it was like a business enterprise before the advent of capitalism.
Capitalism, yeah.
Yeah. So I just think that, yeah, of course, being in the US's pocket for so long, yeah, anything deemed communist would just be associated with the Soviet Union, which it was at the time, especially like, in Afghanistan.
Easy.
And India, I don't know, I guess, that's just the fear that anybody anti-statist is like, loves India.
Even isn't here.
Yeah, double agent.
Yeah.
And I think that what's also interesting is how quickly the state pivoted after 1954.
Okay.
Because the state promoted the formation of the NSF, so the National Students Federation, in 1955 to foster pro-statist sentiments. So to kind of introduce this pro-state student federation, like, hey, look, we're pro-state, we like the state. But as Amar Ali Jan notes, this backfired spectacularly because leftist students quickly infiltrated the NSF and transformed it into one of the most prominent progressive student unions in the country.
And it was the NSF that played a leading role in the protests against Ayub Khan's military dictatorship in 1968. This student-led movement, which erupted during Ayub's much-celebrated decade of development, inspired other groups, workers, farmers, and professionals, to join the struggle. Ultimately, these protests forced Ayub Khan to resign, setting the stage for Pakistan's first general elections.
And after this, the 70s were a golden era for student unions. According to John, campuses across Pakistan became centers of political debate where issues like socialism, secularism, women's rights, and the role of Islam in society were very much discussed. And the literature produced during this period, both Islamist and socialist, was rich and widely circulated among students. And these themes can also be observed in Kamran Asghar Ali's book, Surkh Salam. As we had discussed in an earlier episode of The Armpit Intellectuals, it's titled Surkh Salam, Communist Literature in Pakistan.
However, this period of intellectual and political ferment came to an abrupt end with Zia's military coup in 1977. Zia's regime systematically dismantled both labor unions and student unions, which he saw as a direct threat to his authoritarian rule. His efforts to Islamize Pakistan's politics were supported by the United States, which needed Pakistan as a base for launching its proxy war against the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan, the Charlie Wilson's War.
And it was Zia's regime that marked the culmination of a counter-revolution, because by February 9th, 1984, Zia's government had announced a complete ban on student unions. The groundwork for their suppression had already been laid, as you discussed in your previous point.
Mm-hmm.
It was just this, very steady, but, came with a bang also, you know what I mean?
Today.
And according to John, this was the, I guess you could say, final card in dismantling organized resistance against Zia's authoritarian rule and his Islamization agenda. And what followed was a campaign of repression that not only sought to discredit leftist ideologies, but also targeted students who dared to challenge the state's authority.
The ban on student unions was a reflection of the state's deep-seated anxiety about the power of youth-led movements. Students with their idealism and capacity to mobilize en masse were seen as harder to control than politicians or bureaucrats who could be bought or co-opted.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Just like, sifarish chalta hai, but wo to sirf.
Yeah, students you cannot control I don't know, hundreds and thousands of people, I guess.
Yeah, who are very determined,
Yeah.
and focus on social justice, not on
Yeah.
profit and wealth.
Of course. Yeah.
Unlike the elite class in Pakistan, particularly those tied to landowning families and the military, has long had an interest in maintaining the status quo, which is, you know, just being the ruling class, I guess, and just being able to have infinitely more privileges than majority of the nation. So anything, be it a student union or a labor movement, anything that threatens their powers is swiftly repressed. And that, is can be seen from history as well, I think. Anything that, makes the ruling elite anxious about losing their thrones in society would be,
Right.
of course, why would they be like, yeah, for sure, let's go. Like, communism?
Yeah. I mean, I would say like, yeah, I mean, elite, if you're talking about like families in general, it's not that these people were fed alive from the government as well. People who are also in the elite circles, like, what do you mean by elite?
Well, no, that's true. I mean, I mentioned like particularly landowning families and those in the military elite because they have more power than
Right.
bureaucratic elite. Bureaucratic elite are still very dependent on the government and the military because if
Yeah.
you have a business and I don't know, you need some help with like import or like, I don't know, tax or something like, you need to have government connections
Yeah.
to be able to ensure that your business operates smoothly.
So,
But when you're like a zamindar and you have like ancestral or, generational wealth and influence, or, when you're, I don't know, Tata is like an army general,
right.
it's far easier to get shit done.
Yeah.
And what's the cost of this repression, right? The most obvious impact is the decline in quality education across Pakistan. But of equal importance is the growing inaccessibility of quality education for the majority. And, as discussed, and unless you come from an upper middle class to elite class family that can actually afford private schooling or access to international universities without, difficulty, without taking a loan, without,
Mhm.
your schooling experience, could be substandard or in many cases even impossible or non-existent, right? I mean, we know that child labor, child marriage, right? Bonded labor, brick kilns, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
All these things are still very prevalent
Very
in
prevalent, very much.
Pakistani society. And of course, this, lack of access to quality education has led to a decline in critical thinking and arguably even diversity in the classroom, all of which is directly tied to the state's suppression of student activism in unions. Because if there are less voices, diverse voices in the classroom,
Yeah.
you're going to stay underexposed. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, just an example that I can
We
think
wouldn't
of.
even know what's happening. It's like, the ruler doesn't know what's happening to the common folk.
Oh, exactly. Like, I know I had like, there were a few like, Sindhi and Baloch kids in my school in
Yeah.
Islamabad, for example, but I guess it was like this idea that you don't really talk about your culture if it's
Mm.
from the outside, if you're like the other, because of
Right.
course when you're in not just Punjab but like the capital, the federal
Right.
capital, like I think when you're an ethnic or religious minority and you're the minority in a space,
Right.
I don't really think that many people feel comfortable, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there are people who do, of course, but I think largely, like I didn't know, I knew very little about like Sindh and
Okay.
Balochistan growing up in school. I mean, of course,
Yeah, of course.
Pak
Why?
studies में सिखाते हैं, like, कपड़े मुझे याद हैं, like,
Yeah, yeah.
Balochistan में, जो, I guess, like, जोड़े पहनते हैं, like,
Yeah, yeah.
But honestly, outside of that and like some, geographical things, I didn't really know much. And I mean, it's not like it's a huge cultural difference or anything, right? But
Right.
it's just interesting. Yeah, like that lack of diversity because, I was mostly around other like, like privileged, upper class, mostly Punjabi or like, Pakhtun, like.
Right.
virgin kids.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. The absence of student unions has contributed to the deterioration of critical thinking among students. Repression has stifled intellectual growth, and the state's control over curriculum has exacerbated the problem.
Yeah, and one of the most tragic outcomes of this repression was the lynching of Mashal Khan, who was a student at Abdul Wali Khan University in Mardan. And he was killed after being falsely accused of blasphemy. It's a horrifying example of how this repression, particularly state repression, can mutate into violence. And it's not only state repression, but it's also the state's, permittance and glorification of the blasphemy law, which is definitely abused, as we know. And Mashal's death is a stark reminder of what happens when critical discourse is suppressed, students are policed, even killed, for sharing any ideology that could be easily misinterpreted as anti Islam or blasphemous.
It's not just students who suffer from this repression. Teachers, too, are complicit in perpetuating a culture of violence. Many schools, both public and private, still rely on corporal punishment and emotional abuse as tools for discipline. This reinforces a cycle of violence and limits opportunities for critical, independent thought and arguably even frameworks for empathy, collaboration, and cohesion.
And the state's role in censoring school curricula also can't be overlooked, right? The state is such an important actor, player in this game because it directly relates to students and the right to an informed education. And I remember, do you remember hearing about this? Like a few years ago, there was a biology textbook at Beacon House School where the page on reproduction had been ripped out.
Okay. Yep. That's. I mean, pages are ripped out. Pages are like stuck together.
Oh yeah,
For
exactly.
me, I think it was like stuck together.
Yeah, like
So I remember,
glued
glued together.
yeah, I remember that as well. I mean, that's just a recent example off the top of my head. And it's just also an example of how the state attempts to control the narrative around education, especially around sensitive topics like reproduction, sex education.
Inchi.
And now with this SNC, Single National Curriculum, this is a move that is basically educational apartheid.
Yep, that is. It's like mixing of, making everything a madrasa. So,
Madrasa.
what we think is that student unions could offer a way out of this malaise. They have the potential to democratize education by making it more accessible, especially for marginalized communities. By encouraging students to come together across class, ethnic, and gender divides, unions could help foster a more inclusive political culture. This is why the resurgence of student activism seen in recent movements like the Student Solidarity March is so crucial.
So crucial.
These movements show that despite decades of state repression, the value placed in resistance is still very much at the forefront.
Yeah, resistance is so important. And it's really lovely to see how much resistance, goes on like regularly. ये जो अभी जो सिंध में, protests हो रहे हैं, सिर्फ समय जो.
Right.
Thanks.
Singh Rawadari March. Yeah.
जो भी हो रहे हैं.
Yeah.
ये जो BLA के हो रहे हैं.
BLA. I mean, that is like an old.
Yeah,
statement.
of course. वो तो,
That is a
चलते
bigger
रहते हैं.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's much bigger, of course, than what's happening right now. But as in like these larger and also like, acute and is a weird way to say acute and chronic, but like, yeah, just like, what happens when some kind of tragedy occurs,
Okay.
like that kind of movement, but then also something that is, fighting against consistent oppression and like.
Right.
But yeah, and the role of youth in shaping this political discourse is undeniable. And the state would be wise, I think, to recognize this potential of student unions I think the state would be wise to recognize this potential of student unions as agents of positive change rather than, seeing them as a threat.
Vision.
Because student unions have the potential to make education, as discussed, like more accessible. And that's so important, especially for those who aren't or cannot be in academic spaces.
Yeah.
And it's student unions that bring people together across class, religion, gender divides.
Yeah, they don't want that, right? They don't want the poor folk to be, or subalterns. I don't know if that's a subaltern, to be not studying, because if they study, they're
going to become okay.
Yeah. And that's really, I mean, again, unions play such an essential role. They have the potential to bridge the gap between academic spaces and grassroots organizing, making education more accessible to those who can't afford traditional schooling. This could also result in more lobbying for essential curriculum such as sanitation, nutrition, such as sex education, etc. SEX education. Says sex education.
Sex.
Sex.
Sex. Yeah, we don't like censorships. Am I right?
Yep.
Yeah, no censorship allowed. Manai. But yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, of course. Like, student unions could not only can they help lessen class, religious, gender divides by creating these spaces for dialogue and activism. Activism. I am from Germany, activism. But it's I just really want to emphasize on the fact that the youth, are crucial to shaping the socio-political climate of any nation state.
By the way, the youth is still considered as 18 to 35, right? Right.
I would say so. Yeah, I mean, it's a very loose category.
Loose
Some people
category.
say, 16 to 25. Some people say 18 to 35.
I think 18 to 35 is a correct definition.
I would say that youth in my definition, if I had to have one, youth, quote unquote youth, yeah, I think, like, 18 to 35.
18 to 35. Yeah.
16, 16 thora young ho jata hai, I guess, because it's like this idea of like, minors being in the same spaces as older people who are minors, so I guess that's true. 18 to 35 is his various books. But yeah, so this youth, 18 to 35, I guess, as we describe this, are crucial to shaping the socio-political climate of any nation. And it's a shame that they've been denied this opportunity for decades, right? Like, what, 4 decades? Yeah, 40 years.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And rather than focusing on ethno-nationalist movements, right, ethnic and religious minorities coming to band together against the state would be far more powerful and impactful, I think. Because the state is largely responsible for this ethno-religious strife.
Yep.
It fuels the fire, as do Maulanas, but, the state is also responsible for this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean,
For the idea of like, purity, like, what's happening in Balochistan is like ethnic cleansing. It's like,
yeah, that's for
literally
sure.
like genocide. So,
Yeah. And student unions are crucial for building democratic politics as well as, like, you say that, big leaders come out of unions, and I don't think today we see any sort of trained or sort of like leaders who understand their area, who understand the culture, who understand, who lived in like, rural areas and have had experience in it.
Oh yeah, no, because it's all just like boys club, जो सारे जो बैठ जाते हैं politicians, वो सारे एक दूसरे को जानते हैं कहीं ना कहीं.
Yeah, exactly.
Boys club.
Boys club, yeah.
Everything is boys club.
Boys club, yeah, भाई किसी की गद्दी है, M&A नहीं है, it's like गद्दी basically.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I know him from HSN. Oh yeah, let's give him the job. You मेरा classmate था.
That's true, yeah, that is true.
Yeah. And without these student unions, we're stuck in this cycle of, sifarish, but more so like dynastic politics, and, not just nepotism, but like dynastic politics, specifically elite interests, which obviously includes nepotism, sifarish, and submitting to the United States of America. Yes, father. and even problematic populist figures like Imran Khan. Also, hello, yes, daddy.
Hello, yes, daddy? Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. I'm not your daddy. Absolutely not. There's no room for revolution, right? Or genuine democratic change in that setup where Pakistan's livelihoods grow more and more precarious while all these actors are acting away.
Thing. And if you look at movements across the world, students have often been at the forefront of challenging oppressive regimes. Some recent prominent examples include the student encampment protests in favor of the BDS movement in support of Palestine.
Boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, right?
I think so.
Yeah. I think sometimes I say it wrong, but yeah, it's the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. So, boycott.
In Bangladesh, students were pivotal in ousting Sheikh Hasina's dynastic government after decades of censorship and repression.
Go, Hasina, go, huh?
It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't without violence. But I mean, I don't think if that's real change or not, we'll see about that. But we did see that students were able to organize en masse, and were able to
En masse.
Oh,
French.
which? What wing are you?
Wait. I have
What?
more.
Wait.
We're word. Oh, we're Sheikh Hasina. Wait, goodbye. Yeah, and again, like I know I've said this like 8 times already, probably throughout this episode, but once again, the youth, roughly ages 18 to 35, and their role in shaping the socio-political landscape is just, so important. And, I'm a millennial, right? I'm 30. And, I don't want to be one of those people saying, oh my God, like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, like, I don't even know kya unko bula rahe hain aajkal, but like,
Gen Megatron.
yeah, it's like, ye jo, bade log hote hain jo like, they don't like the younger generation.
Gen Ultralight.
Gen Alpha, Megatron, वो क्या नाम है उसका? वो
Ultralight
Transformer.
Beam. Ultralight Beam.
Yeah, exactly. But you know how, like older people, like some of them don't like, they shit on younger generations and stuff like that. Like, Gen Z ke kafi like, mazak urate hain, like millennials, for example, right? Like, I'm just saying that it's important to,
Yeah.
paving the way for the future generation.
You have to learn from them now. I mean, if you look at what happened in Bangladesh, it's sort of like,
Exactly.
you have to learn from them. You don't have to.
Exactly.
I mean, we cannot make the same mistakes our parents made, right?
Oh, definitely not. The boomers were atrocious. Let me tell you that. I mean, yeah, there's just terrible,
Yeah.
terrible boomer culture. I'm not supportive of that.
Yeah.
But we also have to see, why these certain generations are the way they are. I mean, like, I think, there's this idea that millennials had boomer parents, so we're very, have great work ethic, but now we live in a time and in a, globalized world where things are so unaffordable that our work ethic is going to shit because we're literally not, making money. And if we are, we're not really keeping much of it, right? And then you have Gen Z who are labeled as more disenchanted, more anti-work. Anti-work. And that is, I think that's great because we're in late stage capitalism, right? And, the fact that they have this attitude about, work ethic and 9 to 5. Of course, not all of them. I'm just saying what is, generalized about these generations. So,
yeah.
And I think that's great because, I think that, we have to sow the seeds for future generations. And really, it's up to them how, they want to handle the world once they're in a place of power to make decisions, right?
Right.
And they're a critical component. Are you making fun of the way I say it, right? Right. And they're a critical component of our future.
Right.
Well, that's all for today's episode of Armpit Intellectuals. And thanks for tuning in. And remember, the fight for student unions is a fight for a democratic restoration and liberation for all.